Welcome back, family, to Black House Live's book lecture series, where we are still discussing Dr. Amos Wilson's Blueprint for Black Power. Our last lecture was on chapter 24, the Black consumer and the economics of Afrocentrism. Wilson showed us in that chapter that not only does Black business producers and Black consumers understand the values of the red, black, and green, but white business producers and white consumers also understand the value of the red, black, and green. And Wilson's argument was that if we did not properly control and regulate, right, the usage, right, the promotion, the advertisement, right, understand the true value of the red, black, and green, of the economic Afrocentrism, right, that whites would continue to dominate the black market and control the major shares of the black dollar. Wilson provided solutions for us to fight against that, right? And so in chapter 26, Wilson discusses the importance of Black-owned banks and the role that they will play in the economic revitalization of the African American community globally. So let's jump right into it. Banks as creators of wealth. In this section, in this chapter, Wilson starts with defining what banks are, right? To start with a definition of what a bank is and what the purpose of a bank is, right, is to really set the tone for Black folks who, in Wilson's understanding, in his argument, right, we don't have a true understanding of what banks are and what their purposes are, right? We have these mythological understanding and perspectives when it comes to banks. And so, according to Dr. Wilson, one of the major means that businesses are financed is through loans from banks, right? One of the major means by which businesses are developed, they come to be, right? They're able to be sustained is through loans from banks, right? And using the federal government's definition, right, of what a bank is. Wilson says that a bank is an institution that both takes in public deposits and makes commercial loans. And so banks and other financial agencies, such as savings and loans institutions and insurance companies, take deposits or funds for one group and lend those funds to another group. All right. So mainstream banks, white banks, right, if they're going to make the decision of who they're going to take funds from and who they're going to give funds to, right? It stands to reason that they're going to protect and sustain their group interests, right? Wilson wants us to start to think in group interests, has been arguing for 20 some odd chapters now, right? For the African nation to start to think as a nation, to start to think as a group, and thus the creation of Black banks would serve to sustain African economic interests. Those banks would fund African objectives. And so strategically, the African American community, according to Wilson, must start to think about which African businesses, which African organizations, which African institutions need the necessary funds to contribute to the economic revitalization of the African American community. Other ethnic groups are strategically developing financial institutions and other financial means to finance and sustain their economic realities. And we must begin to do the same thing in more aggressive ways, with more aggressive approaches. According to Wilson, the essential functions of banks are to accept deposits, offer drafts, which is nothing more than, the privilege of writing checks, and to make loans. According to Wilson, there's also a number of types of categories of banks. These categories are as follows. According to Wilson, there are different types of categories of banks, right? And one such type of bank are commercial banks. And so according to Wilson, commercial banks provide a full range of banking services. And so some banks provide services around time, right? Their accounts have certain time limits on them, right? They provide the services of providing checking and loan accounts, right? Time deposit accounts, also known as term deposit accounts, require you to deposit your money for a set period of time. And Wilson explains that although time or term accounts are less flexible than the traditional savings account, these accounts typically earn greater interest rates, right? And so depending on what you're trying to do, depending on what your needs are, a term account might make more sense, right, than a traditional checking account. According to Wilson, commercial banks hold nearly all demand deposits and nearly half of the total saving deposits. And so, as of the printing of this book, there were nearly 15,000 commercial banks in the United States, right? And since the printing of this book, since the 1920s, according to Wilson, right, and the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, which was the creation of the United States Congress, who quotes, "The purpose of the FDIC is to maintain the stability and the nation's confidence in the financial system." Do with that, definition what you want. But according to them, there are currently only about 4,236 commercial banks in the United States, right? And so if you remember, Wilson's discussing in previous chapters America's economic decline in the world and how it has had to compensate for its loss of global dominance, right? Some of that helps us to explain the decline in commercial banks in the United States. Let's continue. Another type of bank or category, right, of banks are savings and loans associations, right? According to Wilson, savings and loans associations began in 1831 as a mechanism for pooling the savings of a neighborhood in order to provide funds for home purchase, which is still the basic function of such banks. And so, according to Wilson, the creation of savings and loans associations were to help folks from particular neighborhoods pool their resources to purchase homes, right? Um, According to Wilson, the nearly 3,000 savings and loans channels virtually all of their saving deposits into home mortgages, right? There's also been a decrease in savings and loans associations, just like we've seen a decrease in commercial banks in the United States. Thus, when deciding who's getting a home and who's not getting a home, communities are obviously going to look out for their own interests. Black savings and loans associations are obviously going to be critical in helping to determine which Black individuals and families will be able to purchase their first homes, right? There's a purpose of why Wilson is talking about commercial banks, talking about savings and loans associations, because these banks, these mainstream banks, are created to provide for the economic interests of white folks. They're not created to fund Black and brown, right, and indigenous economic interests and objectives. Black, brown, and indigenous people are going to have to create their own banks to serve their own interests. Another type of category of bank are mutual savings banks. According to Wilson, mutual savings banks originally intended to serve very small savers. So some of the examples that Wilson gave was the Boston 5-cent Saving Bank. Wilson argued that mutual saving banks can use their deposits for a wider variety of purposes, including investment in bonds and blue chip stocks. So where we just got done discussing the savings and loans associations, and their purposes are primarily for getting folks to pool their resources to purchase homes, right, and get home mortgages. The mutual savings banks can be used for a myriad of purposes, right, including the investments in bonds and stocks. According to Wilson, almost all of the 575 mutual savings are located on the East Coast in places like New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Another type of category of bank are credit unions. And according to Wilson, credit unions are a cooperative society, right, formed by individuals bound together by some common tie, such as common employer or a labor union, right? So people of a particular church or congregation, people of a particular fraternity or sorority can decide to join a credit union and put their resources and their finances in this particular credit union, right? According to Wilson, typically credit union members hold member savings accounts and enjoy access to the pool savings of all members. So all those members who've pulled their resources into that credit union, all of those members have access to those funds. According to Wilson, most credit union loans are for consumer purchases. And so, although there are close to 22,000 credit unions in the United States, they hold less than 5% of the total savings deposits. So, we recognize that credit unions are not used significantly, right? In the same way that mainstream banks are, but might be a strategic advantage or a strategic opportunity to African people specifically. According to Wilson, one of the primary functions of banks is to handle what are called transaction accounts. According to Wilson, these accounts utilize deposits, which can serve to make direct payments to a third party in market or business transactions without having to take a trip to the bank to withdraw funds. Transaction accounts include currency and checking accounts. And so transaction accounts, again, provides the opportunity to be able to make purchases, to make payments to other agencies, to other entities, right, without having to run to the bank, without having to pull cash out all the time. And so many businesses and organizations and institutions have established what are called transaction accounts. Wilson discussed in some of the previous chapters the need and the necessity of African nations trading and doing business with each other, right? And so it is not economically feasible for these business leaders to constantly hop on planes, right, and travel to each country and to transfer their currency, change their currency from one nation to another nation, right, in order to pay their bills, in order to make purchases, right? The transaction accounts are set up that kind of allow for this business to be handled, right, more effectively and more efficiently. Creating money. According to Wilson, a bank in making a loan essentially creates a transaction deposit, which can be withdrawn on by the loan recipient. And so in making a loan, a bank virtually creates money, i.e., makes money available where it did not previously exist. We're going to get into this and unpack this a little bit more, but by an individual opening up a deposit account or creating a transaction account, it now allows the bank to lend a percentage of the money, right, that is going to go into that deposit account, that goes into that checking account, that goes into that transaction account. Once that money is once that account is open, the bank now has the latitude and leverage to loan a percentage of that money to another party, in effect creating money where money did not previously exist. Let's keep going. According to Wilson, transaction accounts, also known as checking, demand, or checkable accounts, are used in about 90% of all transactions involving the transfer of money, right? So the average transaction account is a checking account, right? The average American citizen utilizes a checking account, knows what a checking account is, right? Checks are the means by which the ownership of deposits in banks and other financial institutions are transferred to others. Transaction accounts against which checks are written are money. Thus, when a bank creates a transaction or checking account, it in effect creates money. Loans as money creation. Citing Schiller, Wilson explains that the making of a loan by a bank is the heart of money creation. Money effectively appears out of thin air when a bank makes a loan. Wilson explains, to understand how this works, you have to keep in mind that money is more than just coins and currency that we carry around, right? But that transaction deposits are money too. Hence the creation of transaction deposits via loans, and the same as creating money. Once an individual creates that transaction account, creates that checking account, that deposit account, the percentage of that money that they deposit, right, can be loaned by the bank now. And the bank now has the leverage to create money. What Wilson is trying to get us to understand is that we have to rethink the way in which we conceptualize money. That money is more than just a physical currency that we hold in our pocket. Today, it's more than just the debit cards that we hold in our pockets, right? But that banks have the ability to create money. According to Wilson, when a bank makes a loan, it in effect takes the borrower's IOU, or a promise to repay the loan, which in and of itself is not money, but provides the borrower with something that is money, a demand or checking account. The borrower now has more money, that demand or checking account, than he did before, yet no one has any less. The fractional reserve system. According to Wilson, banks are able to create money because they are permitted by law to operate as part of a fractional reserve system. This system allows banks to lend at levels several times their actual store of cash. The fractional reserve system. It permits the banking system to create money. So when you put money into a bank, the bank is required to keep a certain percentage, a fraction of that money on reserve at the bank, but the bank can then lend the rest, right? So depending on how much money a bank has in its reserve will dictate how much money a bank can lend. And so in this chapter, we'll get to this, right? Wilson is going to harp on this point. The reason why we need Black banks and the reason why we need Black folks to deposit their money, their funds into banks is that the more reserves those Black banks have, the more money they can lend to Black organizations, to Black businesses, Black families, Black individuals. Let's keep going. What this simply means is that in fractional reserve banking, the bank is only required to hold a portion of customer deposits on hand, freeing it to lend out the rest of the money. The system is designed to continually stimulate the supply of money available in the economy while keeping enough cash on hand to meet withdrawal requests, right? So according to Wilson, fractional reserve banking is a banking system in which banks hold a portion of customer deposits in reserves, right? Use the rest to loan to other customers. So let's think about that. Again, mainstream banks, these white banks, if they are going to reserve a percentage, right, or a fraction of their monies and then lend out another percentage of that money, who are they making the decisions about who will get that money or how they're going to divide that money up? And so Wilson is trying to get us to critically analyze the assumption that Black economic or African economic objectives are going to be included when banks are getting out, delving out, their fractional reserves, when they're delving out these loans. It is, it is irresponsible of the African community to continue to expect the white economic structures to provide for African economic objectives. It's just not going to happen. According to Wilson, the excess or extra reserves can be loaned by the bank to its customers and business clients, right? The extra reserves can be loaned by banks to its customers and business clients. So who are mainstream banks? Who are their customers and who are their business clients? Their business clients aren't us. A lot of their customers are us. We deposit a lot of our money in their banks, yet we do not benefit from receiving loans. The ability of the bank, according to Wilson, right, to make loans depends on the existence and size of its excess reserves. So according to Wilson, fractional reserves are only possible because under normal circumstances, as much cash will actually be brought into a bank as will be withdrawn. So banks are dependent on a community consistently opening up checking accounts, consistently creating transaction accounts. Because if the community isn't consistently creating those transaction accounts or creating those deposit accounts, then they cannot provide the community the loans that the community so badly needs. Let's keep going. Bank money. Citing McConnell and Brew, Wilson explains that it is through the extension of credit by commercial banks that the bulk of money used in our economy is created. Wilson argues that those social, political, and economic forces which limit the ability of commercial banks or other financial institutions to create demand deposits, that is, to create bank money by lending, limit the economic and entrepreneurial possibilities of those who may depend on those institutions for expanding their money supply. Right? So the social, political, and economic barriers that are intentionally created, right, by our mainstream government hamper, right, stagnate the economic and entrepreneurial possibilities for African people. right? We understand that this isn't a coincidence, right? We recognize that this is a strategic means to keep, right, the African community dependent, right, on white interest. And so then the question has to be raised, and what are we as African people doing about those social, political, and economic forces, right? What are we doing to neutralize those forces? Wilson argues that it may be inferred from this that the few banks and financial institutions in the African American community, the scarcity of monetary reserves held by those few establishments, and the severely restricted access to credit from the mainstream banks, right? The absence of traditional cultural modes of savings or credit, among other factors, conspire to restrict the creation of money and the supply of money in the community to such a degree that it is made and kept needlessly impoverished and powerless, right? In this chapter and other chapters, Wilson has made it abundantly clear that white supremacy, racism, the history of white domination over African people has played a significant role in explaining why African people are in the position that they're currently in. But Wilson has also held the mirror up to the African community to help us to understand the ways in which we perpetuate and allow this white dominance to continue, right? And so Wilson says that it may be inferred from those social political forces that we just talked about that stagnate and prevents the economic and entrepreneurial possibilities of African people. We can infer that this is the reason why few banks and financial institutions exist in the African American community today. We can argue that those social, political, and economic factors are the reasons why there's a scarcity of monetary reserves, right, in these black banks. And all of this together conspires to restrict the creation of money. The mainstream society, white folks do not want a black community, an African community that can compete with it economically, socially, or politically. It is not in their interest for that to happen. According to Wilson, it is through loans that banks generate funds for business and economic development, among other things. A scarcity of banks, of bank reserves, and other restrictions, regulations, and constraints on banks are directly related to the business and economic development of the communities that they deserve. That they serve. What Wilson is trying to get us to understand, right, is that our lack of understanding of banks, our lack of demands for the need of banks in our communities is the reason, one of the reasons why we are what we are economically in our communities as well. It's because we do not have a value, right, on black banks and black financial institutions. And until we do something about that, right, we will continue to be restricted, regulated, and constrained, right, by those social, political, and economic forces from the mainstream. Wilson explains that it is through banks and other financial institutions that a community of lenders, its depositors, makes monies available to its individual or organizational members and other borrowers to pursue personal, social, and economic ends, including the establishment, the maintenance, and expansion of business enterprises and activities. Many businesses are established, maintained, and expanded through the use of other people's money. And so, what Wilson is trying to get us to understand, right, that it is through a community depositing its money into its banks, not depositing its money into JP Morgan and Chase, not depositing our money into Bank of America, right? But it is us depositing our money in black banks that allow black banks to then lend that money to the black community, to its black organizations, to its black institutions, right? And so many businesses are established, maintained, and expanded through the use of other people's money. So to be clear, that's what he means by that. So it is not that the fractional reserve system is problematic in and of itself, right? It's that those mainstream banks only use a percentage of that money to then only fund white economic interests, right? Not Asian, not African, not Latino, right? White. And so what Wilson is trying to get us to understand that it is not in their economic interest to do that, right? And so that we're going to have to finance our own economic objectives and interests. Citing Mayer, Wilson argues that banking has two distinct functions. banks provide and administer the money supply of the country, right? And secondly, they make loans to selected borrowers. So according to Wilson, to the extent that banks can determine who will succeed and who will fail vis-a-vis ethnic economic communities, the banks and banking system have assuredly determined that the African American community will fail, right? If the economic function of a bank is to determine, right, who they're going to loan their money to, which borrowers they're going to select for who's going to get those loans, and it stands to reason that they are going to put their group interests right before the interests of any other group of people. The historical overview of Black-owned banks. According to Wilson, Black banks have been doomed from the beginning in the U.S., even banks designed to specifically serve Blacks. Citing Angela Wimes' article, Blacks in Banking, a Historical Overview, Wilson explains that the first major banks created or for, although not by, emancipated Blacks in 1866 was the Freedmen's Saving and Trusting Company. According to Wilson, badly mismanaged funds and lack of commitment towards Black investors precipitated the bank's closing 9 years later in the loss of approximately $3 million by over 61,000 African Americans, thus stunting the economic growth for Black people in America for a number of years. In spite of this, Wilson argues that those banks founded for and by Black Americans themselves were on the whole much more successful. Wilson reminded us that the mismanagement of funds and lack of commitment referred to here was not the sole responsibility of Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company's Black managers and employees. A number of its principal managers were white, including white ministers, who share a significant share of the blame for the bank's ultimate downfall. And according to Wilson, the duplicitous role of the federal government in this matter also cannot be overlooked. Interestingly, the great abolitionist and Black leader Frederick Douglass was called on to head the bank to try and avert its imminent demise. Citing Light, Wilson explains that the earliest Black-owned banks appeared in the South between 1888 and the 1900s. Fraternal orders created the financial institutions to serve as repositories for their funds. In the North, the first bank did not appear until 1908. The banks of the North were fewer in number than those of the South and were usually non-fraternal in origin. Citing Light, Wilson explains that between 1884 and 1935, there were no fewer than 134 Black banking institutions in the United States. This does not include the numerous credit unions, industrial loan associations, and building and loan associations, which Blacks also organized in this period. Unfortunately, many of these banks failed. By 1929, only 21 Black-owned banks still survived, and the Depression reduced this number to 12 in 1936. 11 of these remained active in 1945. Thus, of the 134 banks founded, 92% were closed, liquidated, or suspended within a half a century. Since these banks' closings took place before federal deposit insurance, the depositories lost their money. Problems of administration. Citing Light, Wilson explains that Black-owned banks experienced a chronic inability to recruit highly trained and qualified officials. According to Wilson, banking tended to recruit uneducated or less competent graduates of inferior educational institutions. Wilson argues that even today, the outstanding problem facing Black-owned banks is the severe shortage of management talent. And to be a little more balanced, Wilson argues that these smaller Black banks had a heavier burden to bear than the larger white banks in simply engineering their survival. And so only the best trained Black bankers had a fighting chance of averting the destruction which stalked their minuscule institutions at every turn. According to Wilson, there was less room for blunders in Black banking than in banking in general, in mainstream banks. And so, in trying to provide this historical analysis and historical overview of the history of Black banks, Wilson is saying that of the 134 of them that were created, 92% of them failed. And it was largely due to a quality of inexperienced leadership, all of which was not Black, right? There was a significant amount of white leadership in these Black banks, right? That did know better, knew no better. And as of the printing of this book, Wilson was saying that this was still a significant problem that Black banks were suffering from, right? This lack of experience. According to Wilson, in addition to the administrative problems of incompetence and mismanagement, black banks suffered from economic difficulties. Citing Harris, Wilson argued that the economic contradictions of society then as well as now would have condemned the banks to failure, even had they been managed by exceptional skill instead of exceptional ineptitude. Right. So one of the arguments was that, giving the racial, the economic and social contradictions of the society at the time, right? Those black banks were doomed to fail anyway. Those these the white aristocratic and elitist class of that time period were hell bent on preventing this African economic independence. According to Wilson, the weaknesses of historical black banking were unavoidable, and due to an internal need for the black community to find profitable employment for capital and the chronic inability of the banks to do so because of the inability of black communities to support that capital. So then as well as now, right? The demise of black banks have largely been a result of a lack of support from the African and black community. Problems of investment. Wilson explains that due to the contradiction between the bank's need for profitable investment and the lack of investment opportunities in the ghettos, black-owned banks were driven to make systematically unsound investments in ghetto real estate, faltering fraternal orders, unmarketable securities of fly-by-night enterprises, and unsecured loans to individuals. Right. So what Wilson is explaining here was that due to a lack of support from the community of investing in these black banks, due to a lack of investment opportunities that these banks could really invest in the community, there's not a lot of successful black organizations, black institutions for these banks to then invest their money in, right, and then recoup the benefits from those profits. They invested in really shady business ventures in the black community that had no return, uh, 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 had no positive returns for those investments. Wilson argues that had black owned businesses been stronger than they were, banks would have experienced less of a chronic problem in locating investment opportunities. That the banks did experience such a difficulty is evidence that black banking was developed entirely out of proportion to black businesses. The banks that were developed had no idea, were not tied in and tapped into the reality of the black businesses in the community, right? Because had those banks known that those black businesses and community were struggling, right? They were scarce, then maybe those banks would not have been developed at that particular time. There needs to be a plan to do something about the businesses and invest in the businesses in the community, right? So that when those banks come, the banks can invest in those businesses, right, and see returns on that investment. And so then the relationship is mutual for all parties involved. Wilson reminds us that the failure of many black-owned banks were paralleled by the failure of many white-owned banks at the same time. In fact, more white-owned banks failed in the 1980s than the number created between 1888 and 1934. Overall, then, the history of black-owned banking is a tribute to the business acumen and steadfastness of black business persons and the black community. So Wilson is saying that proportionately, many of the same amount of white banks failed during this time period as well, right? And so Wilson says that when we look back then at the history of black banking, we shouldn't look back with this negative critique, right? Or have this sad type of perspective about that history, right? We should celebrate those men and women who had the courage to develop those types of banks, right? And establish this foundation of banking in the United States for our community. Capital accumulation. According to Wilson, banks, financial institutions, and the functional roles these establishments play in the creation and distribution of wealth and power may be looked at from many perspectives. We don't have to just have one regimented way of thinking about how we're going to finance our comeback in this country or in this world. For the African American community, the accumulation of large amounts of money and the use of accumulated money to generate more money is the fundamental means of creating wealth. According to Wilson, after collecting or accumulating capital, banks, by applying certain rules or acting on certain biases, make that capital available to certain individuals or institutionalized groups through loans, credits, and investments to be used for their mutual benefit. And so, in other words, banks use other people's money, people who have been induced, convinced, socialized, and organized by various means to deposit their monies in the banks in the first place, to help make certain other people and the owners of other banks as well wealthy by supplying them with and permitting them to use, invest for their own benefit the monies the banks have collected from their depositors. And so the banks and the owners of those banks are able to use other people's money to generate wealth, right, for themselves and for their families, for their friends. Thus, Wilson argues, right, the key to achieving wealth is to discover ways to execute in some shape, form, or fashion the accumulation and controlling of other people's monies. Right? Our banks, our financial institutions are going to have to use the deposits and the reserves of our community to be able to finance and fund our economic realities and our economic objectives. No one else is going to be able to do that for us. According to Wilson, banks and others use their control over the monies or commodities accumulated from others for their own economic and social benefit. We have to start to do that in a more aggressive means for ourselves. Wilson reminds us that it is apparent that by voluntarily placing or depositing our monies in white-owned banks, insurance companies, retail establishments, right, multiple millions of blacks concentrate or accumulate their monies under the control of the white elite in ways that immensely help that elite to further enrich themselves, right, and increase their power. This increased wealth and power is used to dominate and disempower blacks themselves. So Wilson is trying to get us to understand and see how by us investing our money, right, by us depositing our money into mainstream banks, we are funding our own domination. We are funding the realities that somebody else is controlling us. What are we prepared to do about it? The possibilities of Black community banking. According to Wilson, the history of Black owned banking is most instructive for those who possess a positive vision of the possibilities of Black financial wherewithal. Right? For those Black leaders and community who have a vision, right, of our economic revitalization, then those are the individuals who should be developing banks and leading banks. For those individuals who are tied and tapped into the economic reality, right, of the Black businesses and the communities and what their needs are, and what their trajectory is, right, should be leaders of banks. Wilson reminds us that the African American community is not a poor nation, starved of financial resources and influence, right? That the correct organization and mobilization of these resources can make that community a power to be reckoned with, right? And so, as Wilson has stated, if we've done it before, we can most certainly do it again. Wilson reminds us, right, that neither is the Black community starved of financial talent and genius, right? Our talent and genius is increasing daily through various types of formal education and vocational experience, right? But while Black financial talent is not yet as abundant as it needs to be, it is not as dangerously scarce as it was in the past. And so Wilson says it now needs, above all, unified community support, an African centered sense of direction and commitment, and most importantly, the full support of the African American consumer and investing community. Right, so simply the creating of African and Black financial institutions is not enough if Africans and Black folks themselves are not going to truly invest themselves, right, in supporting those businesses, right, in the consuming and purchasing of those products. So solutions. Wilson says that the development of Black owned businesses, the acquisition of productive property, services, instruments, and investments must achieve a certain critical mass prior to or simultaneously with the development of strong, rapidly expanding Black-owned banks and financial institutions. He's saying that the development of Black businesses have to occur either before or on par with the development of Black banks. You know, remember that previously in the earlier slides, Wilson made the argument that in the past, the growth and expansion of Black banks outpaced and was disproportionate, right, to the growth and the expansion of local Black businesses. And one can't survive without the other. Combined deposits and assets of Black-owned banks. In this section, Wilson will review the organization and character of contemporary Black-owned banks. He looks at the viability of these banks, which he argues is that is their value and the value of their assets, the value of their deposits, right? Their number and size, and their ability to meet the financial needs of the African community, right? Let's keep going. Citing data from the 1992 Minority Bank Monitor, a newsletter published by Creative Investment Research of Washington, D.C., the combined net income of all 18 Black-owned savings associations in 1992 amounted to about $14.1 million. Their total assets in 1992 amounted to approximately $1.2 billion, and their total loans to $945 million. So their total deposits equaled $1.3 billion, and the total deposits in Black America's 3642 as of 2022 commercial banks amounted to about 1.9 billion in 1992. So we can imagine that it's got to be somewhere within the trillions, right? Or at least the hundreds of billions or somewhere near the trillions, right? As of today. According to Wilson, Black-owned and financial institutions, including the 23 Black-owned insurance companies, which combined assets of $4,720 million, certainly are not in the position to any significant extent to determine who will succeed and who will fail in the community, right? While they provide needed services and are the needs for the future growth and financial power of the African American community, Wilson argues that their small numbers and inadequate levels of assets and deposits, along with other legal and physical restrictions, do not allow them to play a major role in the economic expansion of the community at the present time. So the banks as is, right, our Black financial institutions as they currently exist are not in any strategic position, right, to make any substantial amount of changes, right, in our community or any significant amount of impact, right, as is. So this circumstance is the result of a number of remedial factors. And Wilson's going to go on to unpack these that only we can do something about. Nobody's coming to save us. This work is going to be done by us. Reasons for inadequate assets and deposits. According to Wilson, the most obvious factor contributing to the rather low reserves of Black-owned banks is the failure of the largest percentage of African Americans to deposit their monies in them, right? Our Black professionals, our Black workers, our Black folks of all class status, we are not depositing our money in Black banks. Wilson goes on to argue that when one takes note of the fact that between 290 to 400 billion dollars Black consumer market, Black banks have managed to snag only about 2.9 billion of that, and attain only somewhere near 3.2 billion in assets. So it is obvious that the average Black consumer, aided and abetted by Black institutions such as the Institutional Black Church, is virtually ignoring the existence of their own financial institutions. Our Black fraternities, our Black sororities, right? Our Black college institutions. We are neglecting our Black financial institutions. Wilson argues that the primary reason for the underfunding of Black-owned banks appears to be due to the negligence and the lack of knowledge of their importance to the economic well-being of the community by Black individual and Black institutional depositors, right? Wilson is saying that if Black folks understood the value of what Black banks do for the community, then Black folks would support them. The only way to explain this lack of investment in Black banks is because Black folks do not understand what Black banks are, what Black banks do, right, and their value. And that's something that only we can do something about. Ethnic banking. Wilson argues that it is worthy of notice that in Los Angeles, and there exists some 30 Asian American banks. Wilson argues that these banks serve specific Asian groups from specific regions. So you have different cultural groups who are not afraid of establishing banks in their interests and for their interests. And in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, you'll see different ethnic groups establishing ethnic banks, banks to serve, the economic interests of that ethnic group. Wilson argues that if Black depositors increase their deposits with Black-owned banks by even 5 to 10%, these banks, as well as the community, would benefit tremendously. Right? If we just change how much we invest in Black banks from last year, we would see a significant change. Wilson argues that even if Black-owned banks were utilized primarily as secondary depositor institutions by Black consumers and institutions, right? So, or just put a percentage. You ain't even got to take all of your money out of Chase. You ain't got to take all of your money out of Bank of America, right? But if you put a percentage of it in, a mainstream bank, and then put the other half of that in a Black bank, we would see a significant expansion, right, in the reserves for Black banks. Their ability to fuel the African American community, we're talking about Black banks and Black financial institutions, their ability to fuel the African American community economic growth and development and its political economic power would be greatly enhanced. Additional deposits by Black consumers would not only encourage the increase in size of existing banks, but also boost the financial services that they can offer. Right? These Black banks can offer more services because there's so much reserves. Right? With the increase of accounts, transaction accounts, deposit accounts, with the increase of those accounts open in those Black banks, they're able to increase the services that they can provide to the community. This is us understanding the value and understanding why Black banks are so important. According to Wilson, the Black community suffers a scarcity of Black-owned banks, which would explain, right, the reason for the low monetary reserves held by Black-owned banks. Wilson argues that a total of 36 banking institutions, right, which was the number as of the printing of this book, but currently in the U.S. there's 42 Black-owned banks, serving a population of between 35 to 40 million Black Americans, right, spread throughout the expanse of the United States, could garner but a fraction of their deposits or banking business. A solution for this, according to Wilson, an increase in the size and numbers of Black-owned banks and the financial services that they offer would motivate competition by white-owned banks who now take Black consumers for granted. So the very banks that we, mainstream banks that we currently bank with right now, right, kind of their ears would perk up, the hair on the back of their neck would start to stand up, right, with the increase in expansion, right, of more Black banks, because there's now more competition for those Black consumers. Another solution Wilson proffers, right, is that the presence of a significant number of competitive Black-owned banks and financial establishments in the marketplace can in fact lead to the greater satisfaction of Black consumer and community financial needs. So we recognize that we're not being serviced, right, properly by mainstream banks. We expect that with the changing, right, taking our money out of those mainstream banks, depositing our money in Black banks, right, we expect better service. We expect better experiences, right? Other solutions proffered by Wilson is that as Black-owned financial institutions increase in number, size, and influence, their ability to participate in the mainstream financial and commercial marketplaces will be enhanced. And so now with an increase in Black customers, right, Black depositors, right, it now will allow those Black banks to operate in the mainstream economy in ways that they could not operate previously, or without their Black consumers. This can be achieved, according to Wilson, this can be achieved through their increased ability to invest in larger white-owned institutions, corporations, and other financial productive establishments, to gain significant equity and ownership of mainstream businesses, establishments, valuable real estate and services, as well as access to highly lucrative financial activities, right, now virtually closed to Black financial institutions and business persons. If you'll remember in our previous lecture, Wilson stated that the economic revitalization, right, of the African community is not just for us to control the businesses in our communities, right, but we are looking to invest and control mainstream businesses as well. We're looking to be able to dictate terms, right, and make shifts in what is happening in the mainstream economy as well. And the only way we do that is through the taking over and the acquiring, right, of these mainstream businesses. Black-owned banks and capital levels. Wilson suggests that instead of the Clinton administration utilizing the $850 million fund that they proposed to create new community development banks, right, a sizable proportion of this fund could be divided among existing Black and minority-owned financial institutions. So in the 90s, in the 90s, President Bill Clinton was proposing this $850 million fund, right, to create these new community development banks. And on the surface, that may sound like a really good idea, but Wilson said, hold on, Clinton should pump the brakes here. And for the reason that this idea may not be as good as it sounds, that Wilson argues that government grants and its creation of community development banks could create unnecessary competition, right, for community-based Black-owned banks. Listen, we're looking to create competition for mainstream banks. We're not looking for the government to create competition on the small Black banks that already exist in our communities. Exclusive grants to the community. According to Wilson, exclusive grants to community development banks, loan funds, and credit unions financially empower them to directly compete for the same target population served by Black-owned banks, right? And we're not looking to compete with the same folks. We're not looking to compete with each other. We're not looking to take money out of the mouths of our own people. We're not looking to take economic opportunities off of the table for our own people. Wilson argues that the competition could be beneficial in some regards when he says that if it motivates us to improve our services and customer relations, if it forces us to pursue business more aggressively and develop more productive methods of seeking and doing business with large corporations, then by all means, bring that competition, right? Those government grants are warranted if it is going to lead to improvement in the Black community, forcing us to step our game up in the services that we provide one another, right? But if it's not going to do those particular things, we don't need to create this unnecessary competition. Wilson also explains that while competition which encourages these activities has to be supported by the community, its support should not be such that it destroys the very financial institution it wishes to strengthen. So Wilson argues that a more accurately capitalized Black-owned banking establishment could provide superior financial services for the community at very competitive prices. So Wilson explains that the presence of minority-owned banks cuts financing costs to minority businesses and homeowners. So there's other ways to finance Black banks as opposed to directly coming through these government-sponsored grants. Black-led institutional investment in Black-owned banks. Wilson argues that Black individual and Black institutional depositors at mainstream banks and financial institutions can play a crucial role in increasing the capital levels of Black-owned banks. They can do this by using their organizational and institutional influence to motivate mainstream corporate and financial institutions, as well as their pension and union funds, to utilize Black-owned banks for depositors, equity investments, and involvement in various lines of credit. And so what Wilson is talking about is for Black professionals, right? For these Black institutions that currently have their pensions, right, and their savings deposited with mainstream banks. They can use that leverage. They can use that power, right, to encourage that these mainstream banks, right, support these Black businesses, these Black institutions and organizations, right, or to wholesale, divest their money from those mainstream institutions and to place their money in those Black organizations and institutions. And so Wilson wants Black individual and Black institutional depositors to understand the power that we currently possess. Wilson argues that well over 90% of Black-owned individual or institutional deposits and other financial instruments are held by white-owned banks and financial institutions. The demand by these clients that these establishments support the growth of Black banks is only just. And so again, Wilson is showing us how to leverage the power that we have. He said that 90% of Black-owned individual and institutional deposits are with mainstream banks. And so by leveraging that type of support that we have provided to them, and encouraging them to invest in the growth of Black banks. Otherwise, right, we are going to pull our money from these mainstream banks, provides us with a significant amount of leverage. Wilson explains that white financial support, right, into these Black banks do not have to uh, evolve into white ownership of these Black banks either, right? That there are creative mechanisms and creative approaches to white finance that does not involve a white takeover of Black banks. And so Wilson explains that the equity investment in Black owned banks by white owned banks and financial institutions need not devolve into the increasing ownership of these banks by white owned institutions. Wilson explains that appropriate approaches to major financial institutions by organized African groups can be utilized to increase the wealth and power of both their own financial institutions and communities. Furthermore, Wilson explains that existing federal banking laws and regulations can be of value to Black organizations in motivating major financial institutions to make helpful equity infusions in Black-owned financial establishments. So there are some examples that currently exist, right? That African and white folks can use, right, to show that even with white financing, right, white financial support into Black banks and Black institutions, it does not need white takeover or white leadership at the top, right, in order for those Black banks to be successful. Citing the Federal Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, banks were required to increase their lending to underserved, resource-poor neighborhoods with large Black or minority populations. Under a federal law passed in October of 1992, major banks can gain credit toward meeting their community reinvestment obligations by investing in minority-owned banks, right? And so, in the late 1970s, early 80s, the government, through initiatives like this, right, tried to incentivize banks investing their money in underserved, resource poor neighborhoods. Pension funds, corporate American and Black banks, according to Wilson, African American members and leaders of pension funds, labor professional unions, political administrators such as mayors, comptrollers, and treasurers can do and must do more to move their organizations to deposit funds in Black-owned banks. Right, to do business with Black merchants and to invest in Black-owned financial institutions in ways helpful to their growth. Right, Wilson is saying that it is not just the work of the Black community, right, but of our local politicians to also promote and campaign the importance of supporting Black businesses and funding Black businesses. According to Wilson, any number of beneficial relations are possible between Black-owned financial institutions and major corporations. Wilson argues that these relations need not impinge on these institutions' community-based autonomy and ability to manage themselves. Wilson argues that while not as sufficiently supportive of African American economic development as it should be, relative to the consumer support it receives from the African American community, its general economic relationship to the community provides a working model for other corporations. And so Wilson is saying that through the major white corporations that are in our communities, that the majority of Black folks support either through our labor or through our financial means, right? Wilson argues that uh, their financial support into Black businesses, into Black institutions, do not need to infringe on the autonomy of those businesses. While we might need white finances and white resources, we do not need white folks telling us what to do, right, and dictating terms about how we run our companies and organizations. And it's important to recognize that these white corporations have disproportionately, right, reciprocated support, right, in the opposite direction when it has been Black and African people who make sure and has ensured that these corporations have become financially sustainable and multi-billionaire, multiple billion-dollar companies. According to Wilson, the African American community is poorly served by its banks and financial institutions, both Black owned and non Black owned. And so the underservice to the community by Black owned banks and financial institutions is primarily due to certain structural weaknesses, which characterize the economic nature of the community. Due to the inadequate capital levels, capital reserves, and deposit accounts which endemically characterize these institutions, According to Wilson, despite their difficulties, many Black-owned banks are committed to the African American community and contribute mightily to its well-being. So while historically Black banks have not had the positive history and trajectory that we would like to see in our communities, we recognize that Black banks are working for the interests of Black folks. Black-owned banks are committed to the African American community and contribute mightily to its well-being. Without the scarce Black banks that we have right now, some of the Black scholarships that have sent many of our children, our family members to college would not exist today. Citing an example from the 1993 Black Enterprise article that highlights how a Black CEO of a bank, Broadway Federal Savings and Loan, a Paul C. Hudson, after sustaining a fire to his branch, immediately opened offices across the street to keep his operation alive. He also invested $15 million in loans so that riot-affected businesses could make their payrolls. And these were some of the self-help programs that were put into place, right, to ensure that this Black bank could continue to do the work that it needed to do. But this bank didn't just care about, right, the leader of this bank didn't just care about its individual success, right? This bank recognizes that its individual success is contingent on the other businesses in the community being able to sustain itself. So if these other businesses are unable to sustain themselves, there's no purpose for this bank's existence, right? So he invests $15 million in loans so that the affected businesses can continue to make their payrolls, right? Wilson argues that Hudson's example, right, that type of commitment can be multiplied 100-fold to the benefit of the African American community, right? If we were to fully commit ourselves to the strengthening of our financial institutions, right? Black folks have to be committed to investing our money in our banks, in our credit unions, right? In our savings and loans associations, in our mutual bank. We have to be committed to placing our finances, right, in Black institutions. Black financial self-help. According to Wilson, the African American community must be aware of the severe damage it has done and is doing to itself by depositing our monies in white-owned banks. According to Wilson, it has virtually decimated our own economic sectors, fatally wounded our economic body politic by so foolishly placing our monies in institutions which give little or nothing to us in return. According to Wilson, it is the fact that by doing so, right, our depositing of our monies in white banks exclusively, not only is it our money made unavailable to us, right, but our monies are made easily available to white and immigrant merchants and business groups who exploit it remorselessly. Consequently, its monies are utilized to help finance white flight, to help build white suburbs and edge cities and the superhighways which led to them. Wilson is making the argument that our money that we deposit into white banks, we talked about that fractional reserve banking, right? Or then portions of our money is taken and then loaned out to other families, to other communities, right? So that they can continue their dominance. Wilson is encouraging us to invest our money in our banks. African American monies deposited in white-owned banks are utilized to help relocate factories and other business facilities out of reach of inner-city residents, thereby increasing their unemployment, criminality, and general social degeneration, right? By us placing our money in non-Black banks, right, giving them the reserves to invest in their communities and provide opportunities in other communities, it is taking resources out of our communities. It gives those communities no reason to invest in our community because they're investing somewhere else. And so the role we play in the economic destruction of our own communities when we invest our money in non-Black banks. Wilson wants to put this front and center for us to be able to reconcile. We have to struggle with this. We have to solve this issue. According to Wilson, white-owned financial institutions use African American aggregate savings to finance development and economic empowerment of other nations. By depositing our monies with white-owned institutions without demanding and getting abundant returns for doing so, Wilson argues that the African American community is literally choking itself and the Pan-African community to death by its own hands. It is committing economic suicide. We're committing economic suicide, y'all. The expansion of Black-owned banks. According to Wilson, the responsibility for the poor success and retarded growth of Black-owned financial institutions cannot be exclusively laid on the presumed irresponsibility of Black consumers. Black-owned banks themselves must also share that responsibility with Black consumers. And so these banks must also take primary responsibility for their own growth and success. Black-owned banks and services must pursue business much more aggressively, both inside and outside the community. So Wilson is saying that it is not going to be the Black consumer alone that saved these banks, right? It is not solely going to be Black folks depositing their monies into Black banks that save these banks, but right, it is going to have to be these Black-owned banks pursuing business more aggressively, right? Getting learned and educated about banking business, right, and banking practices, right? And being the leaders in that industry. According to Wilson, United Bank of Philadelphia illustrated the possibilities an aggressive Black-owned financial institution can realize by broadening its visions and taking quick advantage of business opportunities when they may occur. According to Wilson, another approach to strengthening the competitiveness and the power of Black-owned financial institutions and with them the African American community is through pooling resources, forming consortiums, entering new markets and mergers. Wilson explains that if these institutions, through acquisitions, mergers, and various alliances, could reorganize themselves as regional, super-regional, or nationwide banks, then they possibly could become 2 or 3 such banks with assets of $2 billion or $1.5 billion each. COVID has provided a particular type of opportunity, right? Many businesses are sheltering through the loss of employees, right? And workers. Companies have had to shelter and close their doors and unable to work in the same ways that they could before. This has created opportunities, right, for other Black businesses. We can acquire those companies. We can acquire those buildings, that real estate, right? The Black banks that were struggling, right, with resource and being able to maintain its payroll and things of that nature can merge into another Black bank, right? And as a result of this merger, can now serve more people and provide more resource for people. And so it is incumbent upon the African community, the Black community, right, to study and analyze where are those opportunities, where it makes sense for Black businesses, institutions, and organizations to merge. Interstate banking. Wilson explains that such a consolidation should permit the new banks and financial institutions to diversify geographically, right? And so again, as we were stating, these particular banks don't have to just serve the individuals in that one particular region. But based on how technology is set up today and based on our strategic segregation around the world, right? If we organize ourselves pan-Africanly, then it allows for us to diversify geographically, right? Our businesses, our business models, right? And how we operate, right? It allows us to expand our products and services across a wider customer base and drive down cost. They should achieve rapid growth as they spread and improve their services to poor minority communities as well as mainstream communities and new areas of business. These Black banks possibly could engage in more lucrative forms of international investment and trade. Their increased size and more efficient organization could be translated into great financial and political clout on local, regional, and national and international scene. And so Wilson is saying that the possibilities of what these banks could mean, what these banks could be, or once organized, right, is infinite. Solutions. According to Wilson, the number and convenience of automated teller machines, ATMs, the placement of many branch offices in supermarkets and other retail outlets, automating as many services as possible and as many banking locations as profitable, forming partnerships and alliances with other financial and service institutions to provide innovative financial and service packages can propel consolidated Black-owned banks into the mainstream of banking and finance while remaining rooted in and committed to the African community. We see a lot of these pop-up bank shops, right? These half bank in places, right, that have no tellers in them, but just like technological computer operated tellers, right? Um, this provides the opportunity, right, for the exchange and the transaction of money throughout the community to flow throughout the community, right? We need these opportunities for Black folks. We need them ran and controlled by Black people, right? We need them visibly available, right, to Black folks in our communities. And so Wilson is saying that the convenience of automated teller machines, right, and many branch offices, right, of these banks provide multiple touch points, multiple service points for banks to be able to service our communities. And we need many, 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 many more solutions. Wilson explains that the financial clout of the African American community depends on mutuality of relations with and among its financial institutions. Right? So these institutions must strengthen their ties and services to the community. They must reach out to its low income constituents, its fledgling businesses, its talented youth and social institutions. They must help to increase the credit worthiness of the community's inhabitants, as well as enhance and stabilize their employment. The community, in turn, must do all within its power to support and enrich its financial institutions, for these are its material resources for economic growth, development, security, and political power. Right? You'll hear people say all the time, right, that this business was created for the people, right? This organization were created for the people. But if we are not in the business of educating the people, right, in the business practices, right, in the organizational practices, right, how can we say that this business was created for the people? Right? If these businesses are coming into the community, we're setting up banks in the community, credit unions, mutual banks, savings, loans, and associations, right? But the folks in the community, their credit scores are still low, severely low, right? Or they don't have the means by which to acquire credit and checking accounts. Then what is the point of us establishing those banks in those communities, right? There has to be work that has to be done in the community for the people to be able to take advantage, right, of these particular type of resources. Wilson explains that the African American community can only look to itself for economic salvation. And it can achieve such salvation only to the degree that it assumes the greatest degree of control possible over its own money and wealth and utilize these to the greatest possible extent in its own economic and political interests. No one is coming to save us, y'all. And we can deposit our money with them and we can shop with them all we want, but those are not going to be the people that are going to provide solutions for us. They're not going to throw any life rafters for us, right? If it comes down to having to save their children or save our children, Wilson tells us all the time they are going to choose their children as they should. So, Black banks, in this chapter, Wilson has provided for us an understanding, authentic understanding of what banks are and how Black banks can be used to revitalize the African community. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to our next lecture on the next chapter ahead. Peace, peace.